Let's create a component for an indicator that is going to show us current state of the day, and this indicator will be just a simple line. So since we have to add this component on the timeline page, we need to open up the component responsible for showing timeline page, and that is the timeline component. So let's open up this component in our editor, and right here in the template, we are rendering individual timeline item elements. Right before unordered list, we're going to use our new component that is going to represent timeline indicator. Let's call this component the timeline indicator. As always, we have to create new file for this component. We're going to add this file to our components folder with the same name as component name, the timeline indicator. And right here, let's start with a basic markup for our indicator. We'll represent this indicator by using HR tag. Then we're gonna disable all pointer events on this element by using class pointer events none. Let's also position this element absolutely, increase the index, also stretch it full width of its parent container, assign bottom border of 2 units, and also let's make the color of this border red. So now before opening up a browser, we have to go back to the timeline component and write down an import statement for the timeline indicator component. So let's import this component from components folder, like so. And if we'll take a look at our page, we don't see any noticeable changes, but in fact, in the tree of components, we see our new component, the timeline indicator. And if we'll scroll up the page, there is this red line at the top, which is our indicator. So the next task will be to position this indicator on the page in such a way that it will correspond to the current time of the day, similar to how Google Calendar does it. So let's switch back to the timeline indicator component. Here I'm going to create the script. And the first thing I'm gonna do is import function ref from the Vue package and create constant indicator ref, which I'm going to assign to our root element of this component, this HR tag, like this. So let's think how we're going to determine the correct position for our indicator. Depending on the current time of the day, we're gonna have to shift our indicator down to the appropriate amount of pixels, and this amount of pixels will be calculated next. So let's also assign the style attribute to this HR element, and the only property that we need to modify will be property top, which allows us to specify top offset. We're going to determine this offset value dynamically by using our custom function calculate top offset. So now we're going to define this function. Before coming up with an actual implementation, let's just return hard-coded value 300 and see how it will be reflected on the page. As we can see, our indicator was shifted from the top of the page by 300 pixels. And now we're going to define all necessary functions that are going to take place in our calculations. We'll call the first function calculate seconds since midnight in percentage. So this function is going to calculate amount of seconds passed from the midnight, but in percentage of all amount of seconds in one day. And of course, to calculate the percentage of this value, we have to obtain the value itself. So we'll need another function, which we'll call calculate seconds since midnight. Also, we're going to obtain the height of this whole block, which contains all of our timeline items, including all scrollable area from top of the page to the very bottom. So we're going to get the height of this block by using separate function with the name getTimelineHeight. In this function, we're going to reference our previously created ref indicator ref, which we can use to get a reference to the parent element, which will be container element. We're going to get the height of which. So in here we can use native DOM API, specifically property parent node, which allows us to get a reference to the parent element. And in this case, the parent element of our indicator will be this div. So this is that wrapping div which contains all of our timeline item elements. And we can get all kinds of information about this element by calling getBoundingClientRect method, which also has property that we need, which is height. And this way, we have obtained the height of the wrapping element. And now we're going to write down the formula by which we're going to calculate the top offset to determine how much we have to shift our indicator down. So first of all, we have to obtain amount of seconds since midnight up until this moment in percentage. We can do it by calling our function calculate seconds since midnight in percentage. And then this value we're going to multiply by the height of the whole timeline, which contains all timeline item objects. And then this value we're going to divide by 100. And 100 is represented by one of our constants, which is 100%. And as a reminder, all our constants are currently stored in a separate module called constants.js. As we can see, 100% constant stores value 100. And now let's go next and switch over to defining another function calculate seconds since midnight in percentage. So in here the formula will be as follows. We're going to multiply 100% by seconds passed since midnight up until this moment, and then we will divide this whole value by another constant, seconds in 1 day. And this way we're gonna calculate the percentage of amount of seconds passed from the midnight until this moment. But we don't have this constant seconds in a day defined yet in our constants module, so let's switch over to constants.js module and right here define another constant, seconds in a day. We can represent this value by multiplying hours in a day constant by seconds in 1 hour. And then let's just move seconds in hour constant definition closer to where this constant is actually used, like this. So now that we have defined this constant, let's go back to our dTimeline indicator component and write an import statement, or actually add seconds in a day constant to the existing import statement like this. So moving on and switch over to define and calculate seconds since midnight function. So right here the first thing we're gonna do is get the current date like this. And then by using this date object, we're going to calculate amount of all total seconds that passed since midnight up until current moment. So first of all, we're going to get amount of hours passed since midnight by calling getHours function. And we have to convert this value to the amount of seconds. So that's why we're also multiplying this value by these constants, seconds in a minute and minutes in an hour. And eventually we're gonna get amount of seconds in the amount of hours passed since midnight up until this moment. And then in the same way we're gonna have to calculate amount of seconds in amount of minutes passed since the beginning of current hour. And this amount of minutes we can get by calling getMinutes method. And finally we also have to add amount of seconds passed since the beginning of the current minute. And we can get this amount of seconds by calling getSeconds method, like so. Let's also make all constants uppercased. And let's see what constants we have to actually import before we can use those. First of which is seconds in a minute constant, and another one, minutes in hour constant. Let's add all necessary imports, and finally switch over to the browser to check our result. And right away we are receiving an error in the console saying that cannot access property of the parent node because our indicator ref isn't defined. And that is because by the time when our getTimelineHeight function gets called for the first time, this indicator ref isn't actually defined, because when this function is called for the first time, current component is not fully rendered and displayed on the page. So this DOM element that this ref points to does not exist yet. So in order to avoid this error, we can simply use optional chaining operator like this. And if value property will be null or undefined, the optional chaining operator is going to prevent accessing parent node property on the undefined value. And once current indicator component will be fully rendered, calculate top offset function will be called again. Therefore, indicator ref will point to correct DOM element, and this whole expression will produce correct value, which in this case is the height of the timeline wrapping element. And finally, in the browser, we can see that the indicator was shifted from the top of the page to this position. And if we take a look at Vue DevTools, we can see that the calculated value of the offset, by which our indicator was shifted from the top of the page, is around 3000 pixels. But there is actually a little problem because this offset is calculated from the very top of the page. But in fact, we have to shift our indicator starting from the top of timeline wrapping element, which is this div. This is actually very easy to achieve because our timeline indicator is absolutely positioned, and all we have to do is to actually make this element to be absolutely positioned within its parent element instead of within the body element. And the way we will do it is by simply assigning class relative to the wrapping element, like so. This class is going to assign property position with the value relative to the wrapping element, and all absolutely positioned elements within this wrapping element will be positioned relatively to parent container. So my current time is around 15 hours and 30 minutes, which is why we're currently seeing that our indicator is positioned at the top of the hour, which corresponds to the 15th hour. And additionally, it is positioned right in the middle of this timeline item, because my current value of minutes is around 30 minutes. So at this point we are finishing this lesson and continue working on the indicator component in the next one, and the link to the source code of this project will be in the video description.